All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tea Talks with Jiling, where we share tea, conversations, and camaraderie with visionary herbalists, rippling positive change into their communities by connecting people, plants, and place. I'm Jiling, your host, acupuncturist, herbalist, and yoga teacher, here on Herbal Radio as presented by Mountain Rose Herbs. So make yourself comfortable, pour yourself a cup of your favorite tea, and welcome to today's Tea Talk with Bevin Clare. Bevin is a professor at the Maryland University of Integrative Health and the program director for the Masters of Science in Clinical Herbal Medicine program. She holds a Master's of Science in Infectious Disease and has studied herbal medicine around the world. Bevin is the author of Spice Apothecary and the current president of the American Herbalists Guild. So welcome, Bevin.
Thank you so much. Hi, Jiling.
So happy to have you on here for the first podcast recording for Tea Talks.
It's
I'm
so
so
exciting because usually it's reverse. So this is great. I love it.
yes. Will you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be where you are today?
Yeah, there's so many stories that I could probably go into, but I've always loved plants ever since I was a child, and I grew up in New Hampshire and in the woods, and I used to go out and explore the woods. I remember I would take ribbons and tie them to the trees, and then I could get further and further out as long as I could always see the last ribbon tied around a tree. I could get back. Um, So, when I think about that time, it's kind of probably a mix between things that actually happened and things that I imagined happened.
Uh-huh.
But I loved plants, and in my teen years, I got to experiment with plants in like a totally different sort of way, and I think that those experiments with plants made me think, wow, if some plants can do these things to my body, then other plants must be able to do other remarkable things. Um, and so I started, studying herbal medicine pretty earnestly in my mid-teens, and by the time I was in my later teens, I left and went to Southeast Asia for a while, and I had some pretty profound experiences that really cemented for me that I wanted to work with medicinal plants for
Mm,
my life. So I
mhm.
think that kind of like kicked me off on the professional path.
Yeah. So moving to Asia and then starting to study plants from there, how do you go from there and tying ribbons in the woods to becoming the president of the American Herbalists Guild?
Well, I think there was a number of factors, and part of it was like having the so what happened in Asia. I mean, at that point when I was there, I had little money but lots of time, so it created this situation with traveling where someone would say, "Oh, you want to go here, it's a 4-day boat ride or for this much money, or it's a 6-hour bus ride for this much money," and the ride was cheaper, so I'd be like, "I'll go on the boat for 4 days." So I really got to do a lot, and um a strange kind of side effect of being in these remote areas. In this particular experience, I was in remote Myanmar, and
Mm,
is that people would see a white woman and assume that I was either a doctor or a missionary, and that
mm,
in either case I might have medicine. Um, and so people would bring me sick people or come up and ask if I had medicine. And for a while I was just like, no, no, sorry, I that's not sorry, but I feel terrible. I mean, they would be so disappointed, and yet I was also I was uncomfortable with the skills, and I also felt like there was an intact medicine tradition where I was, and all sorts of things. But then I finally realized that I actually might be able to help maybe with some of the herbal medicines that were there that I did recognize, and maybe in the process just um collaborating with people. And so that kind of kicked off an experience mostly working with travelers who I met over time, with pretty serious infectious diseases. Typically they were infections uh, where there was no conventional care medicine available. So situations where often people definitely should have gone to the hospital, but there wasn't a hospital. And I got to see what herbal medicine was really capable of. And so when I came back to the States, I went and did my master's in infectious disease. I did an undergraduate in ethnobotany and a master's in infectious disease,
Mm.
and joined the faculty of MUH not too long afterwards. I mean, I was practicing during all of that time period. And so I've kind of been there ever since, but I've developed much more of a passion for the herbalist more than anything else over time. Like, I
Mm.
love the plants and I love the field and I love the infectious disease piece, but I really feel like herbalists as an intervention in our healthcare system is just, they're incredibly powerful and there's so much potential. So
Mm.
I guess that's how I ended up in the AHG role.
Yeah. So, what's your view of the role of herbalists within the integrative medicine aspect of society and medicine and health and well-being?
Yeah, that's it's such a fascinating question to tease apart because it's hard to define, what an herbalist is, right?
Yes.
So I think you can define that in all sorts of ways. I am, and I like the expansive definition of herbalist. I think that works really well, but it is also a really hard catch-all because. If we're talking about a young woman studying to be a curandera in traditions, they're an herbalist. But if we're talking about somebody who's, gone through a much more conventional medical sort of training and using a biomedical model um, with herbs, then they're an herbalist. And so, and all the pieces in between, and they're all valid and they're all important and they all have their place
Mhm.
to work together or in parallel. So I think it's really, I think that there's different needs for different types of herbalism in the healthcare system.
Mhm.
The part that I'm most familiar with and the part that I work with training individuals on is about using a shared language. So having herbalists that also understand conventional physiology and pathophysiology and even pharmaceutical medicine and all of those types of things that use a kind of a biomedical model but also that's deeply rooted in tradition or in traditions. So I think so that's kind of like to start the question is to say like there's different types of herbalism that will fit
Mhm.
into the healthcare system, and that's the part I'm probably the most familiar with in the HG and beyond. But um but I think that herbalism brings a very open-minded, very compassionate, very uh, patient or client-centered model that
Mhm.
can really serve and come from like a non-judgmental place where we look towards principles of things like harm reduction and support where people are and not necessarily like always trying to change everyone to fit a particular model of health.
Mm. Mhm. Within teaching at the Maryland University of Integrative Health, which part of the curriculum do you get to support students on their journey?
Oh, I get a whole, I mean, over the years I've kind of done a little bit of all of it,
Mm.
but the parts that I really love, I mean, there's a few areas of herbal medicine I find especially interesting right now for me. And, one is safety, which is actually something that I remember a long time ago, maybe around like 2003 or so, or 2004, I was asked to do a safety course or to teach a little bit in it. The moment it was held by Simon Mills at the university. And I was just like, I have no idea what I'm talking about. Like, I don't really even know if I believe in any of this. Like, safety was just this pretty abstract thing.
Mm.
Um, and so I think over time, I've realized it kind of is an abstract concept in herbalism. It is very gray. I mean, if safety was a spectrum, from here, if it was like the exploration of safety, it would be like there's like a little bit of white over here and there's a little bit of black and then the rest of it is gray. And so I kind of learned that safety, it's like I was searching for all these answers and a lot of it came down to actually all of the unknown and the nuance and the risk and benefit weighing and so on for individuals. So I love the safety piece. I love working with students around formulation,
Mm,
and kind of clinical strategies in those areas.
mhm,
And I really enjoy doing some work around group facilitation in herbalism as a
mm,
more sustainable healthcare model. And I think lastly, I do some things around writing formal case studies, like publishable quality case studies in herbalism, because I think
mm.
that's super cool because it's not trying to explain how herbalism works, it's just trying to explain that herbalism works, and showing those examples of it. So those are some of the pieces I really enjoy right now.
And you came out with a book.
Mhm.
So,
I did.
Spice Apothecary, will you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm a parent of two, well, who were really little ones, and I I had my first day without anything planned in, I think it was maybe in 8 or 9 years. I just had
Oh.
nothing going on that day, no kids, and it was just I didn't know what to do, and I was like, "I should just take the day off." And then I was like, "I should write a book." And so, which it does tell you a lot about me. That
Yes.
I was like, "I have a day off. I can't." I think I walked like 10 miles and decided I was gonna write a book.
Mm,
And so one of the pieces that I've always been passionate about with herbalism is just accessibility and affordability, and also accessibility, affordability, and sensory aspects of herbalism. I find it really bizarre, like when you go into Whole Foods or something, and you go to the herb supplement section, and it literally doesn't smell like herbs. I mean, it's
mm,
just so wild to have this whole medicinal, and it's one of the reasons I love to travel so much and like, experience these things. So I really liked the book is about spices, and it's about using therapeutic doses of culinary spices. And so really, not just, oh, you hear cinnamon is good for managing blood sugar or something, but like how exactly to use it and how much do you need to use, and then how to get larger doses in your diet.
mm.
Because it's silly to take cinnamon capsules at 10 times the price. All you have to do is just add a certain amount to your diet. So it kind of goes through a lot of formulas that you can use dietarily, a lot of ways to actually add therapeutic spice blends to your diet, and yeah, it's really fun.
I remember in Oregon, I got to take a class with you at a herbal gathering about the use of herbal powders in food. And there was one recipe that really stuck with me with including turmeric in chocolate, how
Uh
really
huh.
high doses of turmeric in chocolate. And I ended up taking that formula out and using it for myself, using it in classes and sharing it with people and using it with patients too. And it's huge hit. And I wonder if there's other recipes that immediately come to mind right now that would be easy to share.
Yeah, I love that chocolate recipe because it
So
just it
delicious.
just yeah, and it's got the synergy piece, it's like because turmeric needs fat and heat to be bioavailable, you've got all of that when you make it. But so the other recipe I really love, and the good news is that I actually wrote it down for Mountain Rose, and it's on their blog. And it's like herb and spice compotes,
Mm.
kind of like herb and spice fruit sauces a little bit. And so if you actually just put that into search engine like Bevin Clare or compote or something, or Mountain
Uh-huh.
Rose compote, you can find it out there. But I really love these because when you gently cook some of these fruits, particularly like your stone fruits, apples, peaches, pears, plums, prunes, things like that, fresh or dried, they have so much pectin and so much, so many prebiotics that are so good for your gut. And then you add in like all the carminative herbs that you feel like adding, whether it's cardamom or ginger or cinnamon or things like that. It can be just such wonderful gut health medicine,
Mm.
and just really tasty and very restorative to your gut flora. And it's just so good. Again, it's like this perfect and very individualized. You can add what you wish. And sometimes I even have people like add a probiotic capsule to it before they eat it, or put it with some yogurt or something like that. So that's another recipe that I feel like is just, it's like everybody likes it. It's tasty. You can get a lot of herbs into yourself. It's super easy to combine. I mean, people
Mm.
use it like with oatmeal or yogurt or meat or just plain or whatever. So fruit
Mm.
compotes are great.
Yeah. So, with including these accessible recipes and utilizing herbs that are easily found in the grocery store or you'll just find in your kitchen or grows around you, these are some of the ways in which you're introducing this concept of accessibility within herbalism. I'm curious about what other ways that you find of bringing accessibility into herbalism and having it be available for people who might not readily be exposed to it.
Um, yeah, I think the spices is really, really key. Because they're also just a perfect multi-generational medicine. And
Mm,
I think that this is especially important because a lot of what we do as herbalists is some prevention. And, because of the social determinants of health, there are so many individuals who are, them and their children and their children's children, and they're all destined towards certain types of degenerative diseases unless
right.
the societal structures change. Um and so, spices can be added for everybody. So I love that. And the other thing I already mentioned, which was group sessions, I mentioned that in passing, but I
Mm,
think herbalists, we are wonderful educators and we can offer a lot. And group sessions leverage a lot of the best of what we have in education, but also to be able to get a little bit more individualized without having people have to spend the money um, for full appointments. So, for example, you could go to, let's say, a church or someplace like that where there's a health group, or you could even put one together and just, a 3 week thing that's 3 hours once a week, where or it could be longer or shorter or whatever, but where you talk about herbs for preventative health, or herbs to prevent heart disease, or herbs to manage a healthy stress response or something like that. I think that
mm,
you can get a group of people, and with a group facilitation model, people can share a little bit about their individual circumstances, and you can leverage the group knowledge and skill over time to be able to
mm,
help people greater, which I think is really important when you're working with accessibility, because as somebody with a lot of privilege, I don't necessarily understand, or I'm not aware of some of the barriers that people face. And so when you have a group, people can kind of support each other through that and talk about what's working for them and
mm.
problem solve together, and so on. So I really appreciate that group model and the possibilities it brings.
Yeah. Are you doing this right now within your community or are you doing it at school as part of the curriculum?
So I'm not doing it at all at this point right now,
Mm,
but I am working with and supervising students who are. So
mm.
that's kind of how. At this point, something has to not happen, and those are
Yes.
some of the things that aren't. But I still get to stay in the game with students and watching, and it's incredibly inspiring what kinds of group facilitation some of them are coming up with, and
Mm.
I'm really inspired by it, things that I would have never dreamed of.
Yeah. So you get to observe these young herbalists learning new things. And what is what is that process like and how do these people come to studying herbalism within a university setting?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? I mean, a university, why? So and I do a lot of kind of counseling for prospective students who are trying to decide, is this
Mm,
something good to do? And I feel like I need to say right in the beginning is that I absolutely do not think a university education is at all necessary to be an herbalist. I mean, I didn't go to university to be an herbalist. I think that there's 101 ways, and I don't think a university education is better than many of the other ways to do this. So I think what sets it apart is that you get a degree, which, like, in itself has some value. It's not that, having a degree in herbalism is better than studying herbalism and not having one. It's just like a master's degree is a thing that opens certain doors as far as applying for grants and so on.
mm,
But anyways, one of the things that's interesting about working at a university is that, because of like the financial aid model, which I won't, go into my thoughts on that, but and the VA and all of that. We end up having a lot of people who may not end up in herb school otherwise.
Hmm.
And so we end up with like a pretty interesting diverse group of folks in the program. And so they're actually often not younger. It's hard, I don't know how old they are.
Hmm.
People self-identify demographically if they want to, but oftentimes, I don't always know. And it's been really, you know so they come from so many different walks of life and different places, and I've learned just, tremendous amounts, that I don't know if I would have ever gained in other ways in my life. So it's pretty amazing to get to sit next to them as they kind of, as we work together. I believe very much in kind of the peer learning model, and I find that especially that works well in at MUIH for me.
Yeah. And for where these students go afterwards, and your thoughts on the herbalism as a profession in general, what are your views and thoughts about the viability of creating a livelihood as an herbalist?
I think it's easier than it ever has been. Creating a viable profession is maybe my number one goal for herbalists.
Mm.
And I've watched a lot of herbalists go through and be able to create a really viable profession. And we've learned a lot. I've learned a lot more about it over the years. I mean, there's advantages and disadvantages to kind of accredited education. One thing that's really difficult but also important is that, we have to demonstrate that people actually get jobs and can pay back their loans, and this is part of accreditation now in the Department of Education
Mm.
because of all of the problems that people have had in the past. So this is like a real thing. So yeah, people are doing a lot of interesting things around integrating with primary care, setting up their own practices, teaching and writing, um, integrating into their communities in all different sorts of ways. And I'm always, amazed with it. The most useful thing that I have seen students do that's allowed them to really succeed is to pick some sort of specialty early on in their studies of herbalism. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you narrow what you're doing as much as you hone in. I think that I think we all realize that herbalism is just the biggest field ever, and that you could study herbalism. You could study just one plant for the rest of your life, and you would still feel like you didn't know everything about that
Mm.
one plant. And so you kind of have to pick some things. But if you choose an area of focus and you really try to go deep, it gives you this tremendous opportunity, because if you genuinely go deep into something in herbalism, you may know more about herbalism and that particular subject, in the kind of English speaking, more biomedical herbalism world, maybe than anybody, depending on what it is. And so I think that's, a fascinating aspect of herbalism and being such a small niche field, is that you
Mm.
have that opportunity. And so I always encourage students to do that. And sometimes it really pays off.
What are some of the specialties that you've seen people coming out with and succeeding doing really well in?
They can be everything from, I remember a woman who worked specifically with neurodegenerative diseases induced by pesticide exposure.
That's very
Um,
specific. That's
It's very
awesome.
specific, but she also lived in an area, and she lives in North Dakota, where
Mm.
like that is not uncommon.
Mhm.
And the reality is, as an herbalist, you don't need a million clients. Like, people, how many people have neurodegenerative disease because of possible pesticide exposure? It's a lot of people. Or urinary incontinence in perimenopausal people, that menopausal people. I mean, that's like I don't know how many, perimenopausal people there are that have urinary incontinence, but there's got to be like millions and millions and millions. And what's on offer for them? Cuter Depends and Kegels and things like that. So, there's a lot of things. I think there's a lot of low hanging fruit that we just have to think about. And it's something I always talk to students about, is like, what do you think is needed? And even
Mm.
ask people, what do you think is needed out there? Because you suddenly find, that that people are like, oh yeah, if somebody could help me with this or that, that would be great. So I think that that's a really, and then you can also like spend time writing about that and doing
Mm.
classes or webinars, or just kind of really building your knowledge in that one area, and that seems to really help.
So turning that back around for you, what would you say is your specialty?
Oh wow, it's changed over the years, right? So
Mm.
the infectious disease thing I really absolutely loved and felt really passionate about. At the same time, it's a tremendous amount to keep up with, and so much of it is about public health. And so, it was like it just depends. So I think I think it's changed. It's like the spice thing. I think would definitely be it.
Mm.
And what else would be a specialty for me? I'm actually really, the things that I'm really passionate about more recently that I feel like I have a higher than average level of skill and knowledge are, one is pedagogy, is like how to teach
Mm.
healthcare providers and integrative healthcare providers. And that's, so there's two things that are kind of very peripheral to my typical herbal world, and this is one from working in a university so long, is like understanding how people learn, and
Mm.
more, less conventional ways of helping people explore information. And not, I do very little lecture in classes. It's very different. Sometimes I do no lecture. It's other types of exploration of information. And so I think that, and then also for me, traveling and traveler's health. So I spend, it depends on who you ask in my family, but I probably spend about 70% of my time traveling, and I love
Wow.
it, and it's just a huge passion of mine. And so uh, so I feel like, yeah, there's that piece that I ended up with a lot more. I have a lot of skill and a lot of perspective on staying healthy when you're traveling, but also how to navigate a lot of that. And I'm working on a new project that will take me in that direction a little bit, because I've always got this like personal travel thing, and then I've got my professional herbalism thing. And I've been kind of thinking about how to pull the two a little bit more together. So yeah, so I've been having fun working on that.
I remember taking a different class with you in a different state. At the Midwest Women's Herb Conference, you
Oh,
did,
okay,
yeah, you
yeah.
did a class for herbs for travelers, something like
Hmm.
that, a couple of years ago. I
Yes,
loved it because you
so
wove in
fun.
so many of your traveling stories. And I wonder if there's some potent traveling stories that you would like to share, especially ones that tie in herbs or learning about herbs or mishaps with herbs, perhaps.
Oh, there's just like a million. I mean, it's so hard to figure out what, but I think part of it is just like being really creative and understanding what the herbs are always there. They're always there. And also, as an herbalist, if you are an herbalist and you can recognize a basic set of herbs, you can pretty much find herbal medicine that you recognize all around the world. I've
Mm.
been to very few places in the world where there isn't like ginger and cinnamon and chamomile and mint and things like that. They're there. And also you can use your senses to determine like what a lot of them are. If you don't know what it is, smelling it, you'll be like, oh, right, okay, this smells just like, and you can probably guess what it is. Of course, it's always good to confirm, but like, so so I'll tell you like just a really funny off the cuff story. I remember I was nursing my son, and I ended up getting um, like just this weird little nipple problem, get nursing. And I was like, oh no, I need to do some compresses. Like this is what I need to do. But I was staying with my parents at like a resort in Mexico. It's not my typical adventurous travels. I was like totally in this resort sort of thing.
Uh-huh.
But I was like, I've got to find some herbs, to fix this. And I remember I went to like a little tea shop, a little coffee shop, and I was like, do you have any herb tea bags? And they had mint, and they had chamomile, they had linden, And so I got some mint and chamomile tea bags. And I remember I asked for like a lid of a coffee cup, just like a standard lid of a coffee cup, and a bunch of tea bags. And I like soaked them in the water for a couple minutes and then packed them in the lid and slid the lid right into my bathing suit top. So I was like a little bionic woman with this weird like round breast thing. And it totally worked, and it was just, it was funny to me because it's not like what I would typically do, but also just, herbs are everywhere and they don't have to be fancy preparations
Mm.
and the utility is just there. And, I don't know how long those tea bags have been sitting around, but like they did the trick right away. So I
Oh,
think there's like, I love some of that piece around traveling is part of it is just figuring it out, whatever you need to do. Feeling like you've got some kind of GI thing going on and going to a restaurant and bringing them a bag of garlic as a gift, which usually costs very little, and asking them to include a lot of it in your food.
mm,
Things like that. There's so many ways to navigate it. So
mm.
yeah, I love the kind of traveler health piece. And just figuring out like how to stay well. So my kids and I just spent 6 months of the pandemic abroad in mostly Abu Dhabi and in Oman,
Wow.
and just so there was a whole nother like health piece of like how to keep us healthy in a place. It's not like I could bring enough herbs for 6 months, so navigating all of that and making sure we had what we needed to stay well and the what ifs. It's fascinating. It's always such an adventure. I never get
Yeah.
bored.
Yeah, so learning a lot about being creative and utilizing what you know, asking questions, exploring, and
Mm.
looking for coffee tops.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Exactly. I should have done, in retrospect, I should have gotten two because I think it would have looked a lot less weird. People would have just been like, huh, funky bathing suit. So that's my tip.
Yeah. How do you manage to spend 70% of the year abroad?
Um, it's not always abroad. Sometimes it's domestic,
Okay.
but it's just I've kind of shaped my whole life around it.
Mm.
And I have friends all over the place, herbalists,
Uh-huh.
and I do a lot of speaking abroad, so that also gets me places. And I think part of it is also, you know, i- it's it just keeps me present and alive, and I have an incredible amount of wanderlust. So I'm always kind of listening to myself, and COVID was very interesting because I was home, like
Mm.
home for months,
Mm.
months and
Mhm.
months. Like it was actually, I got back right in early March as things were happening. I came home and didn't leave again until September, basically, other than some little road trips. And and once I left, I kept wondering, like, when will I get tired of this? People always would say, like, oh, you'll eventually get tired of it. But 6 months, I was like, nope, not tired of it. so, so I do
Wow.
have a home, and but the university offers a lot of online programs, and I absolutely love the one of the biggest evolutions in my life is going from like Monday through Friday in the classroom all the time, to teaching mostly online, and absolutely loving it and realizing how online education done the right way integrates into people's actual lives instead of taking them away from where they are and like putting them in a classroom.
Mm.
Done correctly, online education is just like it's in their home, it's in their community, and so learning how to create that has been such a fun journey.
Yeah. So how do you, earlier you were talking a little bit about pedagogy. How do
Hmm.
you take this experiential learning, non-lecture based teaching style online? How does that work?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, online learning is actually better for that because it levels the
Mm.
playing field. So,
Mm.
we've all been in a classroom, right, where somebody asks a question and you know who's going to answer it, right? Like I mean, I can spend 20 minutes in a classroom and I'll tell you who in the future will answer 99% of the questions you ask because some people are faster or more confident or anything. So, online education, because it's mostly asynchronous, just kind of levels it. So here's an example of I think a course that works really well. And what's interesting is I've taught this course in person a lot. And now it's online. And so I can compare the two. And I can
Nice.
compare the two from my experience. So in this course, students get a case study that doesn't have any therapeutics. It's more like, well, this is what's going on for this person. Um, and and in the classroom, we would discuss it. We would talk about it. But it would really only be part of the students that would actually discuss it. And in a way, I'd always be standing at the front. Even if we sat in a circle, the energy would be pretty heavily weighted towards me, and we would discuss it. And they would kind of assume that I was the most knowledgeable about it, and they were contributing. In the online environment, what happens is one student takes that case and assigns everyone in the group a detailed biomedical question. So it might be like, what is the connection between insomnia and menopausal cycle menopausal cycles, or sorry, let's say menstrual cycles. What is the connection between the two, and how do fluctuating hormones impact sleep, if they do? And so that's one student, and every student gets a different nuanced question, and they go out. So they get that at the beginning of the week. They go out. They have 3 days or so to look at all the primary literature, to look at all the research, to bring back a whole, almost a paper about that particular thing. And so you get 20 students who are looking at every little aspect of that case, illuminating everything, and
Wow.
illuminating it in a much more contemporary way than I would, because there is no way that I could spend a collective, 65 hours researching all of these things every time I did this. It's not going
No.
to happen. But with a group, each student can do that. So they come back and report, you read everybody's stuff, you end up with a huge amount of information about what you're doing. Students start to post formulas, and everyone comments and assesses the different formulas using a rubric around, like, the dosage is appropriate, is this how you should prepare these herbs, like, is it safe, how will it taste, all of these types of things. So you can start to see, like, I'm in there and I'm commenting and I'm reading and I'm learning, but like, they are the experts in what they're doing, and they are, those peers are doing that, and the flow is very tight. Like, we're often online at the same time, people are asynchronously chatting. The whole thing will happen within 5 or 6 days from start to finish, and then we do another one the next week. But it's super different than sitting in a classroom and standing up at the front and telling them how to work with this particular case or health condition, with their comments. So does that make sense? It kind of gives you an idea of, like, how
Yeah.
the structure can totally change. And it's much more exciting for me. Like, I don't get bored, because every time they bring something new and I'm like, oh wow, that's fascinating. So I love that.
Wow, that's an amazing way to get the students' fingers really deep into the
Right.
research and really invest everybody's energy into studying
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
cases. Yeah.
Right. Right. Yep.
So, what do you feel like is the direction where herbal medicine is headed right now?
I think that, again, I think, speaking of much more of, like, the English speaking biomedical herbalism, which is what I know the most about, I think that we are in a place where maybe as a community we're a little bit more aware of um, the important aspects of justice and equity in health, and how herbalism fits into that. And as the world, or some of the world, becomes more aware of the structural imbalances in our societies and in our healthcare and in our ability to meet individuals where they're at, I think herbalists have increasing relevance in those conversations.
Mhm.
So I think that's a place that I feel like we, as a community or as individuals, we just have so much to offer. In places where there's mistrust of conventional medicine, and not necessarily reinforcing that herbalism, if people have mistrust in conventional medicine, saying, oh well, here's herbalism, but also helping individuals to navigate that healthcare system, and to maybe invest some trust in our conventional care system, in a it may be a different way, and building bridges and finding ways. So I think it's a lot about just helping individuals who are sometimes overlooked. I think herbalism does that really well.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that building bridges element. That's the term that came to mind for me as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I always like that, because I think that we can do that, and that's why, for me, the flavor of herbalism, of being more biomedically aware, allows us to communicate more effectively with primary care providers. I think when we
Mm-hmm.
understand some of the language and can use some of the language that they might be used to, and so that, I think, in turn, right, builds a few more bridges.
Beautiful. Well, we'll start wrapping up. Is there any final words that you would like to share before we head out into the world again?
I think, as I just said, like the last piece, I do want to share that I think another place that herbalists can be really useful, and I'm talking about, again, this kind of more biomedically savvy herbalists and so on, is for creating increasingly, um, for making sure that all herbalists have a place at the table as we go forward in doing this, because I think that if we do speak the same biomedical language as conventional care providers, we are able to kind of open doors and build bridges. But I think it's so important, as we do that, to not leave all the other types of herbalism behind, to
Mm,
make sure that we are, reinforcing, especially kind of different cultural systems of herbalism, that their place is incredibly important and relevant at these tables, as we look for how we're going to be navigating our own healthcare and wellness and relevance, and just the cultural competence of herbalism
mm,
can be really high if we understand all of the types of herbalism. But if we kind of narrow it down so it looks a lot more like conventional biomedical medicine, then we lose that. So
mm.
I think that that's an important part of what we're all doing. And just,
Yeah.
if you're an herbalist and you're starting out, to pick that passion and go with it, and really try um to find out what the great need is in the world, because there's so many, and see what you can do to meet that.
Mm. I have another question. What are some
Sure.
of these needs that you feel like are really rising to the fore for you right now?
I always think of them at the wrong times, right? It's like thinking about, you're going to do something on your computer when you're in the shower or something. So,
Yeah.
I think so. Here's one that I was just thinking about recently. I think there needs to be a lot more healthcare directed at teens. I
Mm,
think that. I think this comes from having a kid who's a preteen and realizing that, like, apparently they're supposed to go to their pediatrician until they're 18 or so. And their pediatrician has, like, those balls on the tracks, and, like, little pictures of cartoons and stuff like
not
that.
really age
Um,
appropriate.
yeah, and I'm not sure, like, what a teen years are, where a lot of health stuff really gets cemented. Like, teens are often very health savvy around what is in their toolkit to keep them well. And I always think that that's, like, a key thing in life, is, like, you need to have your toolkit, and whatever you want to have, as many things in there as possible to keep you healthy and well. And so I think teens, and creating a space for teens that's valid. Teens are, there's huge amounts of stress from all different factors, and also a lot of health disorders start to come up in those teen years too,
Mm,
and that you haven't had before. And so I think that that's an area right there,
mm.
that someplace, I think, every herbalist that starts in the next few years could look at teens, and I think we still wouldn't scratch the surface of what is probably needed out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for giving voice to that. And I
Sure.
guess it's really present for you right now with your child coming of age.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, Bevin, thank you so much for joining us today. And so wonderful to hear your voice and hear about your adventures and all your wonderful contributions to the herbal realms.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun to, like, sit in the other seat and do this. I've enjoyed it a lot. I can't believe it's already over.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions or comments, or if there are any herbalists that you want me to interview, then please email me. Find all of my contact info on my website at jilinglin.com. And thank you again, and we'll see you next month. Cheers.